Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. On today's episode, we're going to talk about calcium reactors. When, how, and why I think you should consider switching from dosing to calcium reactors. Alright, thanks for joining me on another episode of Parker's Reefs. Now, I should preface this episode with the statement saying I'm not suggesting everyone out there get rid of dosing and move over to calcium reactors. I do believe they have some benefits, and particularly in some scenarios, and we'll go over that. However, there is nothing wrong with dosing, and I'm not throwing shade at you guys that are dosing or anything like that. I just want to explain when I personally think that I'd rather switch to a calcium reactor, which I have just done over the last couple of weeks with my Dream Reef tank here. And whilst working in my local fish shop on Saturdays, I've had a few people say, you should do a video on that, because they've come in and they've looked at calcium reactors. They want to know they're currently dosing, they want to know when they should consider switching, and then once they do decide they've reached that point, how they go about turning their dosing off and turning their calcium reactor on. So I figured, what a great opportunity to do a video, and here we are. So I guess we should start off with when I think you should consider moving from dosing over to a calcium reactor. And this is one of those things that's going to vary from person to person. Personally, I find when your dosing amount becomes quite large, and that's obviously a fairly subjective term, but basically whatever dosing containers you've got, if they're not going to last you a couple of weeks and you're having to top that off, whether that be alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, or all three, personally to me that's a good sign that you need to switch to a calcium reactor, because it's something that it's happening too frequently. If you're only getting a week or two out of those containers and you have to top them off, to me, that's a point where things can go wrong if you need to go away. It's pretty hard to ask a tank sitter or a house sitter to top up your calcium reservoir. It's getting a bit much. The next point I'd like to consider of when to switch from dosing to calcium reactor is when you're starting to spend a lot of money on supplements. Now, thankfully, there's a few ways around this. I know a lot of people like to buy pre-mixed components of whether they be A, B, C, which is normally your alk, calcium, and magnesium with a bit of trace mixed in there. That's all good and well in a small tank, but if you're getting to the point where you're starting to dose 200, 250 mil of these components a day, and they cost a good amount of money per litre, it's obviously going to become quite a cost that you'd just rather avoid. Now, thankfully, like I said, there's ways around that. You can mix up your own alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. You can even supplement your own traces if you want to, quite cheaply. However, again, it comes back to that first point of if your dosing containers are only going to hold a couple of weeks worth of supplements, then you probably need to consider looking at something else. Well, at least consider it. You don't need to, but consider it. All right, the next reason why I like to consider calcium reactors over dosing, and that is balance. This goes way back a number of years ago with my previous tank in this location here. When I didn't even know about calcium reactors, and we're talking about 8-9 years ago. I was dosing and I had a great little Kamoa doser. I was mixing up my own Randy's recipe, alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. And every week I'd test religiously. Sometimes I'd test midweek as well, but every weekend I would test. And I think over the course of about 6 months, I didn't have one weekend, maybe one, but I can't recall it, where I was happy with all three values. I always had to adjust one up or one down, or two up and one down or something. I could just never get all three balanced. After chatting to one of my reefing gurus at the time, he suggested I put on a calcium reactor, and because I'm a bit of a gear junkie, I quickly jumped on it, switched over, and within a couple of weeks, instantly my alkalinity, calcium, magnesium were all level. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're all at exactly the level I wanted them, but if they were low, all three were low, and if they were high, all three were high. It made it so much easier, because I know when dosing, your alkalinity can affect your calcium, and your magnesium value can affect how quickly they seesaw between the two, and it becomes quite a challenge to get all three on point. Personally, I find with a calcium reactor, you've got just one parameter there you're changing. We'll go into how and how to set them up a little bit later, but personally I find it's much easier. You've got all three, plus a little bit of trace element mixed in with this media as well. That's just going to come up and down, and you can adjust that for your tank's requirements. So that's probably the main factor for me. But there is one more point that I like to cover with when to switch from dosing to calcium reactors, and that's really if you're a bit of a gear junkie. If you like new toys, if you're itching to do something to your tank, if you're the type of person that likes to play with new equipment and you have the room for it and you have the finances for it, a calcium reactor is an awesome toy. They're just really out there bits of equipment when you explain to people that you put dead coral bone into it and then you put a gas in there which lowers the pH down to melt that coral bone, basically to put a liquid supplement of coral into your tank that the new living corals then eat and consume to grow. It always brings a pretty shocked face amongst my visitors. So if that's the type of person you are, then by all means consider a calcium reactor. And if you've already got a dosing pump with a few heads on it, awesome. You're going to be able to use that for potassium, strontium, manganese, all these other minor and macro and trace elements that I would highly recommend you add to the tank at some point in time. So don't be quick to throw out your dosing pumps. Of course, if you need to sell them to help fund the calcium reactor, I wouldn't hesitate on doing that either. But if you can, hang on to them because they may still come in handy. All right, I guess that pretty much covers the when I would consider switching from dosing to a calcium reactor and why I would consider switching from a dosing setup to a calcium reactor. Now we need to discuss the how, and this is the part that most people are interested in because there's no shortage of great videos out there showing you how to set up a calcium reactor, but personally I haven't come across a lot that show you a good, simple method if you're already dosing, how to come off dosing and come up to a calcium reactor, because ultimately it's all about stability in our reef tanks, and that's one of the main draw cards of a calcium reactor is that stability. So the last thing you want to do is pull out the life support on the dosing, plug in your calcium reactor and go, everything's going to be good now. We want to slowly transition off one and onto the other. Now, I totally understand why calcium reactors are a confusing subject, and that's because there are so many variables to them. You've got a pH in the reactor, you've got an effluent through the reactor, you've got media, you've got bubbles per second, lots of things to consider. So which ones do we set constants and which ones do we adjust to dial our dosing pump off and to turn our calcium reactor on? Surprisingly, it's not actually that difficult. It's all about just making as many of those variables we talked about as constants. So the variables we want to make constant are the effluent rate through the reactor, the pH in the reactor, the media within your reactor, and the bubbles per second from your regulator. There's too many things there. If you're going to start changing all four of those, it's obviously going to cause issues. Now, the obvious one to make it constant is the media in your reactor. It's not something you're going to pull apart and change all the time, but I do recommend for a longevity that you pick a media that your local fish shop's going to be able to get for you consistently. I know a lot of my friends over in America are having trouble with the Two Little Fishies Reborn calcium reactor media. It went on the market, came off the market, a new one's come back out, and it seems to be a little bit different. You want to find something that you're going to be able to get constant supply of. Now, I say constant, you're not going to need it all that often, but you want to make sure that when you do top your reactor off every 6 or 12 months, that you can get hold of the same media. So for me, that's ARM Extra Coarse. Doesn't mean that's the media for you, it just means that's the one my local fish shop carries. I've had good success with it. That's all I need to know. That's one of those variables turned into a constant. The next variable, and this is one that can be an expensive option, but it just makes life so much easier, is the speed of the effluent through the reactor. Now you can just tee the water supply off your return pump or off another pump, run it through the reactor and have a little tap that controls how quickly that effluent is. That can vary, believe it or not, as that tap gets a little bit clogged or as the pump slows down and it wears out and whatnot. That effluent rate can change, and I have to admit on this system here, at first I just teed it off my return pump for the first week, and then after a few days I wondered why my alkalinity was bottoming out, and it turned out that the little tap had clogged. So straight away I had a Versa sitting on the shelf, I ripped it out and hooked it up. I've set that to be 50 mil a minute. Now that's a fairly arbitrary number. For me, that's just what I've gone for because it's a little bit more than a drip. It kind of switches between a drip and a trickle. Somewhere around there is good. Realistically, you make it 100 mil a minute if you want. You can probably 200 mil a minute's too much. You can make it 10 mil a minute if you want. It's going to be a little bit slower. No big deal. You just want to have a constant there. So that's my constant, 50 mil a minute from the Ecotech Versa. Now, the next one I want to talk about is the bubbles per second from the regulator. As touched on, I do like to use the carbon doser regulators, and the main reason for that is to eliminate one more of those variables. I can set that to be 1 bubble per 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, whatever I need to do, just to be just quick enough that when the solenoid is turned on and the CO2 is entering the reactor, that it just slowly brings that pH level down to the set point. You don't want to make it so that it blasts it and the pH goes up and down. You want it to be just enough to slowly bring it down. With the carbon doser, that's super simple to set, and more importantly, if you bump it or you change bottles or whatever it may be, you can set it back to what you had before very, very quickly and easily. It's super repeatable, and again, is all about eliminating another one of those variables. So the carbon doser, I like to set it, at the moment it's running at about a bubble every 2 seconds, but I have a fairly long run for the CO2 bottle, so when the solenoid does open, it tends to vary a little bit there, but the main thing is my pH slowly comes down to the set level, which is exactly what you want. All right, and last but not least, our final variable is the pH within the reactor. Now this is the one variable that I do like to adjust. What I do when I'm setting up the calcium reactor is I start that without any gas going in at all. So the pH 3 reactor will probably be around 8.3, 8.4, 7.9, whatever your tank's pH value is, it'll normally run around about that. I like to run it for a week or so to make sure with the effluent going through it with no CO2, just make sure that it's all bedded in, all the bubbles and everything's all out of the way so you can focus just on the CO2. Then what I do is I reduce my dosing levels by say 5%, and I'll reduce the pH that is in the reactor down a little bit. Now, a little bit's obviously not the value you're looking for. To give you a starting point, my reactor was showing it a pH of 8.3 when I had no gas in it. So at first I dropped it down to 8.0. Now, that's probably the biggest jump you're gonna do, because after that, what I do is I watch my alkalinity. Thankfully for me, I've got a KH Guardian that tests every 2 hours. If not, I'd highly recommend you test your alkalinity in this phase every day, if not twice a day, just to see where it's at. So what I did then is I just slowly bring that pH level down as I bring the dosing down. So I bring the dosing down about 5%. I bring the pH in the calcium reactor down about another 0.1 to 0.05. I wait, give it a couple days, make sure things are stable. If the alkalinity is going up, I will increase the pH in the reactor, which means it's melting less of the media, means the effluent is less potent, and it'll allow the tank to stabilize again. If it's not enough, if your alkalinity is going down, you also reduce the pH in your reactor down, which will make the effluent more potent, and it should bring your alkalinity back up. Again, make very, very small changes and give it a little bit of time after you've made the change to see a result. You will soon enough get a bit of a feel for what percentage of your dosing you can bring down to match that with the pH in your reactor. For me, it was about that 5% amount of dosing and about 0.05 in the pH of the calcium reactor. Now I've got to the stage where my dosing is turned completely off and the pH in my reactor is sitting at about 7.0. That's still fairly conservative for this tank, but I don't have a huge amount of coral in there and therefore not a huge amount of coral growth just yet. As that coral does start to grow, or I put more coral in there, I'll keep an eye on the alkalinity, and as that starts to get a little bit lower again, as the tank's consuming more than the calcium reactor is putting in, I'll continue to lower that pH set value in the reactor down further and further. The one time when I would consider changing any of those other variables is if I get down to about a pH of about 6.5, and if it's still not keeping up at that point in time, I will increase the effluent speed through the reactor. I'd probably at that point raise the pH back up a little bit again and bring the effluent up to say 70 ml a minute. See if we can get a little balance again, then bring the pH down. And again, once I get to 6.5, if it's not able to keep up, I'd bring the effluent up to say 80 or 90 ml a minute, bring the pH back up, keep an eye on alkalinity. You just sort of play that game. Believe it or not, you will get to a point very, very quickly where it'll just sit on autopilot. You'll find that equilibrium, you'll find the effluent rate and the pH value in your reactor that'll just meet your tank's demands. And of course, that will most likely, the same way you do with dosing, increase over time. As your tank needs more, you just slowly bring that pH down a little bit by little bit. The main benefit is it's going to dose alkalinity, calcium and magnesium at balanced levels to your tank. So you're only looking at one, whether it's low or high, rather than trying to balance all three. It just makes life significantly easier. All right, guys, I hope that has helped. I realize that I haven't gone into ultra specifics about any particular calcium reactor or media or any other part at all there. I tried to keep this video as broad as possible so that you can adapt the concept to any calcium reactor and dosing scenario you have. If you do have specific questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments section down below. I will personally respond to each and every comment that goes in there, so if you do want to get hold of me, that is the best way. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And last but not least, if you're yet to subscribe to the channel, please consider doing so. I like to put out lots of different videos going over reefers, tanks, coral wholesalers, store tours, updates on my Dream Reef tank, you name it, we're going to cover it here. So if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any future videos, hit that subscribe button down in the corner and you won't miss any in future. Other than that, guys, till next time, stay safe, keep reefing. Bye.